Welcome to another Lowe's Kitchen Bread Test Mixers Edition. Does the mixer we're using change the outcome of our baked goods? I tested 3 popular mixers on the market right now, KitchenAid, Bosch, and Ankarsrum, to see if there are any noticeable differences specifically when making bread. I used my tried and true classic sandwich bread recipe that I've been using for years. And I also performed this test with zero compensation from any of these brands. I just wanted it to be an authentic test for my kitchen to better our bread making. Just as I did with my bread flour brand test, I had meticulous rules. I weighed every ingredient, mixed everything at the exact same time, and baked it all in the exact same oven at the exact same time. I wanted to eliminate any possible variables I could, except for the most important variable in this test, the mixer. It was definitely interesting to see them mixed up side by side. One thing I've never loved about KitchenAids is how tricky it is to add the flour. The open bowl of the Bosch, the Ankarsrum definitely made this aspect easier. And the Bosch definitely stayed the cleanest during the mixing process. The other 2, I had to scrape down a lot more. I got each one to my favorite point in the dough when we're done adding flour, just when it's slightly tacky and not overly sticky. I quickly shaped each batch, let them rise, and then put them in the oven at the exact same time using the exact same bread pan. Cutting into each of the loaves of bread was super fascinating. You can see, starting with the KitchenAid, it definitely had the tightest crumb structure and the smallest amount of lift. Next up from that was the Bosch with a similar crumb structure, but I felt like a little bit more open and a little bit more lift. And then finally, Ankarsrum definitely had visually the tallest lift and the most tender crumb structure to the slice of bread. This was me examining it with a super critical eye. When I did a blindfolded taste test with my husband, though, we honestly could actually hardly tell a difference between each of the slices. All the breads were incredibly tender and tasty. I did feel like for me there was one slice that I could tell a little bit of difference between, and when I found out the results, I wasn't surprised to see that it was the Ankarsrum. That hand kneading approach really made a difference in the tender outcome of the bread. But my husband, who usually has some pretty critical taste buds, said he couldn't tell a difference at all.
What was interesting was the biggest difference was the process of using the mixer. And that tells me something important. It tells me that it probably doesn't matter exactly what mixer you have, but knowing and understanding your mixer thoroughly and how bread will operate in that mixer to achieve the best results. Every mixer behaved differently in mixing the dough. One thing that's always really frustrated me about making bread in KitchenAids is that dough seems to get stuck at the bottom. What happens with this is not only is it not really getting a full kneading rotation, but it makes it seem stickier at the bottom. So I've found that most home bakers are adding a lot more flour when using KitchenAids because it just always looks and feels a little bit stickier, even when you're probably done. So if you have a KitchenAid, you can still make amazing, great homemade bread in your KitchenAid. Just know it's going to look stickier, it's going to feel stickier. So follow the recipe, learn what it feels like. You may need to scrape the bowl a few more times, but you can still get amazing homemade bread. Next up with my Bosch users, this to me was the easiest mixer to use. Unlike KitchenAid, where these knobs kind of like get a little bit stuck for me sometimes, I love the really easy on and off smooth dial of the Bosch. I also love that it's an open lid feature, unlike the KitchenAid where it was really hard to dump in flour. I love that the Bosch provides that open center to allow it to be easier to add more flour as needed. To me, the Bosch also had the least amount of babysitting. I was able to set it and forget it. Now, I do recognize that I do have a partial bias because it's the mixer I am most familiar with. I've been using a Bosch for over 20 years. So I was cautious about that bias in the process, but I found that it was really comfortable. It kneaded the dough really, really well. One tip for Bosch users, if your dough seems like it's struggling getting a full rotation, or especially if you're using a smaller batch, this guy will be your best friend. This little extension piece that you can use with the dough hook pulls the dough a lot better, especially with small batches. It'll help it not get stuck around that center ring and knead a lot more evenly. So if you're kind of having issues, add this super inexpensive addition and it will dramatically change your kneading experience. Last but not least, the Ankarsrum. This mixer is super interesting to me. It's a Swedish mixer. It's really unique in that it moves the bowl instead of like any kind of center column, which is really fascinating. The way that the attachment, the roller attachment kind of bounces with the dough is supposed to mimic the motion of hand kneading, which lends to usually a lot more tender bread. There's also other really cool features like the dial has a timer, so you can really set it and forget it by turning it on with a timer when it's kneading so that you can walk away and not worry about your mixer over kneading. To me, that's not the biggest selling point that makes me want to spend a lot more money, only because it feels super easy to set a timer on my watch or close by. It's only an 8-minute need. I'm usually not going too far away. The other tricky learning curve about the Ankarsrum is that it does look a little bit more wet. There is a little bit more babysitting with the knob. To me, the bottom line is if you have a mixer that's working really well at home, you're not looking to replace one, I wouldn't feel like you need to run out and replace one just for the sake of getting better bread. You can still achieve really good results with any of these mixers at home. If you're looking to replace a mixer, or if you're baking a lot, need to add another mixer, then there might be some important things to consider. Let's go through a quick pros cons list. KitchenAid, it's affordable, easy, no learning curve, easy to use. Cosmetically, I feel like it wins. It has the smallest footprint on your kitchen. If I was gonna leave one mixer out on my kitchen counter, it would definitely be a KitchenAid. But there are a few downsides of a KitchenAid. To me, these like turny on and off things are a little bit frustrating to me. They kind of get stuck, especially if you have an older KitchenAid, they kind of get a little bit jammed. I don't love that. I also don't love like spilling in the flour, and then when you mix it, it like spills everywhere compared to the other mixers. For the sake of the process, it's not my favorite mixer to use for mixing bread. So if you're making a ton of bread and you are looking to upgrade or exchange your mixer, I don't know if I would choose a KitchenAid for bread. Even though the outcome's the same, the process is still frustrating for me. And you do have to be a lot more conscientious about how much flour you're adding. Bosch, we all know how I feel about this one. No, I'm just kidding. With the pros and cons of this one, I would say the pro is it has really high wattage, higher than most KitchenAids. It has just a little bit higher of a price point than like the lowest line KitchenAids, but once you start looking at nicer KitchenAids, these are pretty comparable in price. So if you're gonna spend $400 on a mixer anyway and looking at a $400 KitchenAid versus a $400 Bosch, and you're really into specifically bread making, then I would go for the Bosch. Some downsides about the Bosch. It has a wider footprint. It's cosmetically, it's not as easy on the eye to leave on your countertop. It also has some unnecessary things. It does have like a blender attachment that I don't know anyone that uses their blender attachment. If you do, I'm so happy for you. But I have a separate blender. But I love the high wattage. I love that mine have lasted over 20 years, and I love the open bowl. I love that it's easy to mix. I love that there's no babysitting. Ankarsrum, fun new mixer. They come in a lot of different colors, so maybe you'd be more inclined or comfortable leaving it on your kitchen countertop. Like we talked about, the timer dial is a cool perk. They do come with also a lot of different fun attachments. Also has really high wattage. It's a high quality mixer that should last you a really long time. Downside of the Ankarsrum is that there is a significant learning curve. It feels like Ankarsrum does come at a higher price point, and there is a lot more babysitting. Now, all these mixers have different attachments. If you're doing other things besides bread making, like making meringues, making cookies, frosting, all of those things, I would talk in a whole different way about all the pros and cons. For example, I actually love using a KitchenAid for mixing meringues for macarons and things like that. I love the whipping motion of that compared to the Bosch, even though all three mixers can do everything. Especially if you're on a budget, I don't feel like you need a separate mixer for separate things. But again, if you're specifically honing in on bread making and using that as a primary tool for your mixer, then I would primarily vote Bosch. Second to that would be Ankarsrum if you can afford it. The lowest line KitchenAid won't last you as long as the others based on personal experience and just the text of the wattage. But if that's within your budget or that's what you have at home, just know you can make amazing bread. It's more about the method that you're using, how much flour you're adding, and the ingredients that you're adding that's really gonna make the difference. So jury's out. What do you think about these three mixers? What mixer are you inclined to get, and what questions do you have about these mixers? Stay with us, keep following along for more bread tests in my kitchen.